When I was a little one, my parents took my sister and I to Sunday school when they went to church. It was the same church where we went to preschool and the Presbyterian church where my father's parents had been active members for more than 30 years. I don't remember much about it. I'm not really sure I cared for it much, and I don't remember being heartbroken when we stopped going, somewhere around kindergarten or first grade when my mom went back to work. After that, we may have attended church occasionally for a while, but we really were only regular on Christmas Eve. Even after my parents divorced, we made the annual trip. Later, my mom would experiment with Easter services too, but at different churches. When we were still fairly young enough that we sat in the balcony so that my sister and I could color on the floor, not color on the floor, but coloring books, without being a distraction, we went to my mother's church, an Episcopal church. I remember them doing communion there. I did it once that I remember just to see what it was like, and the metaphors of body and blood were completely lost on me. And I found the idea of it all to be repugnant, as you can imagine, for an 8-year-old who has no understanding of the body and blood being invited to partake in. I was much happier playing in my grandparents' yard. They had a pond just large enough that we went swimming and canoeing in it when I was little, and where wildlife would come and spend their days. Canadian geese, mallards, every once in a great while a heron, and other fowl would sometimes come through, as well as deer and woodchucks. Oh, and the sounds of the frogs and the toads and the crickets and the bugs that could be heard all night. My grandmother had a statue of St. Francis in a flower bed. He seemed at once both slightly out of place and completely natural. In the summers, my grandparents would set up a tent in the backyard, partially under some trees at the top of the hill, just steps from their back door. And my grandmother would be out there for hours, drinking coffee or tea, working on crossword puzzles, and listening to the wonder of life. Not only did my family rarely attend church, we almost never talked about religion at home either. All through school, I heard about friends who had to attend catechism, Bible camps, Hebrew school, while I was free to play outside, to read, or do whatever. I learned about the world's religions either in classes or from my friends. My closest friends in middle school and high school were Jewish, Buddhist, and Christian. So I had no frame of reference for understanding much of anything as it related to Christian dogma or scriptures. I'd been told by a couple of folks that I'd be going to hell for not following their rigid beliefs. Even then, I was confident that hell was created here on earth. I remember once, probably when I was in high school then, my grandmother, whose home was so magical for me, saying to my mother, sister, and me something along the lines of, "I didn't think you were believers." She said it in a way that the words meant to sting, and yet I couldn't fathom how it would have been otherwise. That's what I was thinking about when I read the title of the launching pad pieces for this year's service. Tom asked me to deliver this sermon, and I was looking forward to learning more about the man, the minister, the scientist so well loved here, among the many to whom I owe thanks for the freedom to grow up unchurched. The pieces, a sermon Priestley delivered in 1785, and a reflection on it, however, were at times painful to read, in part because of the context he was writing in, but also because of the way that We sometimes cringe when we recognize ourselves in something that we don't find flattering. The sermon was delivered when Priestley was still in England. Thinking of our American history in 1785, the United States had gained independence less than a decade before and was a loose confederation of 13 states at that point. The United States had just adopted the dollar as the monetary unit in July of that year. There was no real federal government at the time. Everything was quite precarious. Everything here was an experiment, and Europe, too, was on edge. The French Revolution started just 4 years later, and things were already getting quite heated there and elsewhere. Notably, November 5th, 1785, was also the 180-year anniversary of Guy Fawkes Day, for any V for Vendetta fans. Remember the 5th of November, also called the Gunpowder Plot, a celebration of Protestantism over Catholicism, a theme that Priestley clearly found to be significant. Catholicism, or popery, as Priestley called it, and Protestantism were at odds then, not casually, but in terms of who ruled the country and whether people were allowed to practice their faiths freely or be persecuted for them, and regarding who was theologically right. And spoiler alert, it was the Protestants. Priestley writes with the confidence of a scientist, the confidence of an educated man used to speaking with other educated men, and maybe women. In an age when rationality and logic were highly valued and so presumably considered the propelling element of change, he also speaks as a man whose logic is considered flawless and expects others to see this and, as they would with a scientific argument, convinced of the truth, be persuaded to change their ways. The importance and extent of free inquiry in matters of religion is laid out as other such treatises of the time were, even much like he might have written out a scientific argument. It is perhaps for this reason that his proofs seem to make some assumptions about our abilities to reason, about what is best for us, about whether we are competent to reason for ourselves, and if not, to be supportive of those who can. Priestley was sure that people would hear Unitarianism's logic, that being the greatest virtue God has given to us, reason, and join Unitarian ranks. He calls his audience to respect Luther and Calvin's work to attempt to restore us to true matters of importance of faith, but says they did not go far enough. Really, they barely started the work to be done, and at that time he recognized how much work there was to do and how much would still be left even after his time. As we gain knowledge, he says, and become more inquisitive, more questions will arise, and this is how it should be. The emphasis on free inquiry makes Unitarianism valued, he would say, as Unitarians inquire and investigate every item and continue to remove any that are unfounded. This, too, was painful reading, with our practices even still of, shall we say, overanalyzing things, debating long and hard to come to consensus on the greatest minutiae. It has value, too, to be sure, but the downside is there. But Priestley continues, even going so far as to say that, but should free inquiry lead to the destruction of Christianity itself, it ought not, on that account, be discontinued. Priestley is indeed confident in Christianity's truth, but his statement is still bold and unwittingly a long thread in the weave of our Unitarian history. We have surely not destroyed Christianity by any stretch, but we have rewritten what is possible within it. And I find myself wondering what Priestley would have thought of this. That is one of the parts that give this sermon its continued importance, and others too, like this. Ideas probably more widespread and comfortable now, if still heretical to many, more than Unitarian has come to be. Priestley wrote, "If indeed we confine ourselves to things that are necessary to salvation, we may stop whenever we please, and may even save ourselves the trouble of any inquiry or investigation at all. Because nothing is absolutely necessary to acceptance with God and future happiness in some degree, besides the conscientious practice of the moral duties of life. What doth the Lord thy God require of thee but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God? But certainly we may mislead ourselves if we restrict our inquiries by this rule, as according to it, Christianity itself may be said to be unnecessary. For do any of us think that a virtuous heathen will not be saved? Paul says that they who are without the law of Moses shall be judged without that law. They have the law of nature and of conscience and will be judged by that." Priestley goes on to say that, of course, this is good, but to be a Christian is better. The acceptance of the ideas Priestley shared in that passage has grown in the last more than 200 years. Lots of folks still believe that the only way to the Father is through Jesus and other Trinitarian beliefs of salvation, but I also hear a lot more acceptance and variation about what people believe, even here. Priestley's assertion further means that professions of faith are not required by God, which remains a fairly bold statement today. We might also read that passage and the whole of the sermon as saying that we choose faiths that feel right to us, that are reasonable too, but he implies that none are wrong, except maybe popery. He was not fond of Catholicism. These are ideas that are still worth promoting and will continue to spread, not because they are Unitarian and not because they are the most reasonable, but because they speak to the utter essence of Protestantism and wider human truths, that there needs be no intermediary between God and human, and people want that personal relationship with God. As I was reading Priestley's sermon, I was also reminded of the clear assurance that many have in our faith, the certitude of its bestness, and how that has marked our history. One way that it is still transparent to me is when our humanist protests at the terms God and Jesus, and even church and practices of liturgy, as though humanism is the highest evolution of religion, better, smarter. And even as a humanist myself, this hurts my heart. We exceptionalize and exclusivize Unitarian Universalism in harmful ways. I actually think it's one of the barriers to our congregations, a theological barrier, a sense that to be considered welcome in our congregations, we have to leave any God or Jesus beliefs that we have at the door. Unless it's God's plural, paganism is fine. We still have quite a bit of work to do there. Reading Priestley's publication was a reminder to me about who we are and who we have been. The promise of this faith is great. Priestley demonstrated that more than 200 years ago, and we still have so much to offer. Priestley's ideas were heretical and prophetic for his time, but maybe not the ones that he thought would last the ages. So it is with us too, I think, although I suppose we won't know what has lasted well for another 200 years or more. But I do believe that people are not going to be attracted to Unitarian Universalism because of the rightness or reasonableness of our beliefs, but because of the way we practice them. They won't come to us because of our, shall we say, frugality or other cost-saving ways, but by the way we give to the community, the way we steward the earth, the way we are in relationship with our staff and with ourselves. People won't come because we don't believe Jesus was the Son of God and the Holy Spirit is a third embodiment of God's self, but because we believe in a love that transcends us all, that is greater, wider, deeper than anything we can conceive, and that holds space for the wonder and magic that is each and every one of us. I don't know for sure, but I feel very strongly that we too, like Joseph Priestley, are in a revolutionary time. I'm not sure what the coming years will bring, but my being senses that there is more change coming for the good. Unlike Priestley, I will not at this dark time dare to risk my faith on humankind's reason. That's how we got the current abomination in the White House. But I believe that we are moving into a place where better for all will prevail as we continue ever to grow toward the beloved kingdom dreamed about by so many. We grow there together, doing our parts to bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice. And we do so by beginning here and taking our best and most beautiful love out into the world.